Yeah, that makes sense. Mine's called a Honda Civic.
Lame.
That's what I did. His name was right on it when I got it.
Howie. What?
Howie. Oh, that's right. Yours is Howie.
No, yours is.
You're.
She won't name her car.
No, it's not that I'm not going to. It's that I haven't felt the right name come along.
See, I appreciate that.
And I've had the car for over a year.
They got to be similar to like superhero names.
I don't think necessarily, but that's one of
Those
those.
kinds of like, yeah, like
Peter Parker. My first car was a blue truck, and his first blue truck.
Oh,
So,
My old car was red, and her name was Roxanne. After I started
I'm ready to
I
think about
got
it.
so used to it over the course of like 8 years, you know? So when you get a new one, it's like,
so we're good to go.
You don't seep into it.
Now, I work all summer on it. My friend drove it after me having it, like, she was driving it to class, and she wrecked it.
God
That's why I have that lovely duct tape on my car.
damn it.
That's crazy.
She doesn't have the heart to ask her friend to pay.
Oh,
I can relate to
there's a bear running around my hometown right now.
another day.
No, that's
classic.
never happened before, ever. So like the police are telling people to not approach it. Don't take pictures.
You have to tell people.
No, you do. You should see what they have to do at the green.
It's on the bottom.
When I was at Yellowstone, there was this older man getting yelled at by a park ranger. I don't think anybody decided to come.
Wow, this is a record turnout. No, actually, I can see quite a few people are attending online tonight. And then when I looked at the, in case you didn't realize this, if you don't show up for class, but you watch the video, records are left both in YouTube and Moodle. And actually had people that were here, about 6 people who were here last week, access the video, which is kind of a good thing. Because I was, think about that in terms of how long you have to sit or how long you all have to sit. I got the best end of this deal because I'm up and moving, right? I don't want to be sitting down anymore.
What if none of us showed up though, and then you were just
that happens with the,
about that.
well, and if I've got half of the class showing up, because YouTube shows the icons of who's watching, so that's not a concern. And then with like the 542 class and then the leadership and decision making class, so half the people will show up online, half the people will access the video later. So I think we're going to be moving to a lot of this, especially with the master's degree program in IO. It's more convenient for students and gives us a little bit more geographic reach. Now, where this could get a little bit interesting for tech is with a lot of the online programs like the University, a legitimate one like the University of Southern New Hampshire, there really isn't any such thing as in-state tuition or out-of-state tuition. And the courses for a lot of these online programs are actually cheaper than on-campus classes. And kind of curious as to how that would impact tech, because they do actually end up collecting a lot of out-of-state tuition from people. And then for people coming from Texas, it's actually cheaper to come here than it is to be in-state in Texas, as undergraduates. Anyway, questions about anything, comments, concerns? Heat index, what is it, like 105 right now? And I'm thinking we're only into August, or only into June. What is August going to be like? Possibly getting hotter. I thought I'd have a little bit of fun with test patterns while people were waiting. The one I kind of grew up with, the one that, okay, was the, might have a, okay, this one. Did anybody ever see this on TV? Okay, when I was a little kid, this would come on because the stations would go off the air about midnight, 1 o'clock, and this would come on, and this would be on from midnight till about 7 a.m. whenever the morning shows came on. So part of this was, it was there so that if you had a tube-type black and white television, you could adjust using the pattern, get everything squared off. And that was something that used to happen quite a bit with the old TVs. There were TV repair people come to your house and fix things so that your black and white, whatever it was, 240 line picture would be clear. It's like, you know, I'm glad to be alive now when we're spoiled by having, you know, high definition television. Movies are actually worth watching. And sporting events, you can actually see the field view. You can see people move on the field. The other hand, you have to pay for television. Anyway, what does that have to do with psychometrics? Give me about a half an hour to figure something out. Okay, some of the things I posted, I said we would discuss whether or not psychometrics is a pathological science. And then it's like, okay, said that not knowing how many people would show up, so I'm going to move that discussion to an online chat. You all done this before? Yeah, class with Toddy. Well, Toddy does that with a lot with the undergrads. Yeah, I'm getting kind of blank stares here, so that's a no. Okay, that's kind of fun. As long as you don't engage in the same kind of behaviors that people will engage in Twitter or Facebook when they're trolling somebody. I mean, that's one of the things that's kind of amazing to me is that people will get post things that, you know, profanity and a total lack of civility, and it's like, you know, wait a minute, you're not as anonymous as you might think you are. And then the other side of that is, even if you thought you were anonymous, what are you really contributing to anything being some kind of useful, meaningful discussion? So, and then the thing I typically do is I stay out of religion and politics when I'm online, because the thing is, everybody that's accessing those sites are so fixed in their positions, you're not going to convince anybody of anything, right? People, at least in this country, people pretty much solid themselves. Like, nope, this is what I believe, and I'm going to believe it, even if somebody presents some compelling data where I would reach a different logical conclusion.
You've been on that tonight.
Yeah, I actually posted something this past week.
I stopped. I looked at the feed for about 2 weeks and was really hooked for about 2 weeks, and then my husband was like, Amy, this is really toxic.
I could see that it could kind of be toxic. If you kind of look at the website, there's like 17,300 some people on it, but there's probably only about 2 or 3 dozen that participate. So it's like, I'll go in there to see if anything's happening in Ruston or anything's happening with road construction or anything else one would need to be aware of. And then it's like, okay, let's watch the back and forth between Chris Butler and Bruce McGee. So Bruce McGee is in the sociology department here in Campus History. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Pretty nice, pretty smart guy. The people that tend to post from the community outside of tech tend to be, what, a little bit to the right of Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, so that kind of gets reflected. A good starting point for tonight, if you all haven't talked about this, is the idea of the criterion problem. So the citation for this, if anybody's interested, Austin, Villanova, and I actually got to meet Austin one year. 2012 at IPAC, the International Personnel Assessment Council, when he met in Las Vegas, and was talking to him about testing and things like that, and then finally looked at his badge and was like, Austin, oh, like the criterion problem guy. You have the same last name. He's like, no, I am the criterion problem guy. So how cool is that? That somebody that does something substantial, something that has a lot of impact, is pretty much approachable. And that's kind of what I've learned over the years too. If you go to the smaller conferences that deal with testing, some of the big names are perfectly happy to sit down and talk to you. If you go to the bigger conferences, I think it's sort of like people go in protected mode so they don't get overwhelmed by crowds of people that want to talk to them. Or the other thing that's happened in the last 5 years at the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, or at the Association for Psychological Sciences, a lot of people are now taking selfies with the person that wrote their favorite article. So I'm kind of thinking that would have to get annoying if you were one of those people. Well, anyway, what Austin and Villanova did was they kind of developed a simple model for looking at what happens with criterion. So what is criterion?
The outcome.
The outcome, some kind of outcome. some kind of performance measure. If counseling people would also say that it could also be whether or not people do or do not possess some kind of psychopathology like depression. And, you know, when we're talking about measurement, it comes down to the same problems and same issues. So we have right here the conceptual criterion. So this would be what it is that ultimately we should measure. Okay? Or we could also, instead of conceptual criteria, we could have the ultimate criterion, the perfect criterion. Oops. Yeah. I'd like to be able to say that it's hot tonight. I'm done. Right? And then, you know, there's certain things that you could do that maybe even tenure wouldn't protect you from getting cheat out. So let's not even go there. Besides, I really like this stuff. This is fun for me, even if it's visible for y'all setting. Now that sounded what? A little bit less than empathetic. Soccer, y'all, soccer. Okay, so conceptual criterion, and this is the operational criterion. So here's what you're actually measuring. And here's, we could say, what you should be measuring. And the problem with any kind of criterion measure is sometimes we miss things, or we don't identify everything in this that should be in this. Sometimes just because of how we're measuring, we can't measure all of that. So we end up with something called criterion deficiency. So if this is what we're measuring, and this is what we should be measuring, so here's what we're missing. Okay. Now, anybody that's had any kind of performance appraisal, do you often not get credit for the things that you did on a job? Or if I'm administering some kind of test or any other, you know, instructor in any class, you covered, you know, what, 10 billion words between the beginning of class and the midterm. How many of those words, how many of those ideas actually can show up on the test without that test being as long as all those class periods? And then as long as it took you to do all the reading. So you end up with that same kind of problem where, okay, this is everything that could be included within this domain, and here's what we can actually measure. Now, again, performance appraisal, everybody does a lot of stuff that they didn't get credit for with some kind of test. You know, here's everything you studied for that test, and here's what actually got measured. If we were looking at something like clinical depression or bipolar disorder, this could be all the things that characterize clinical depression or bipolar disorder. This is what we actually measure. And in some cases, this is why it makes sense to do multiple measures or do different forms of measures. We're going to put all the stuff into some kind of linear composite, because then what can happen is when we sum all those measures together, we actually end up having or measuring more of that. So the perfect outcome for this would be like a full eclipse, right? The operational criterion is going to completely eclipse the conceptual criterion. We're going to see this brilliant corona, no, maybe not the corona, but everything else, right? In other words, we covered everything. We have to be aware of is with respect to what we measure, where the operational criteria actually measures the conceptual criteria, is this area right here. This would be the area of relevance. Okay. So this is the part that's true score, that's free from error score. This is, you know, the real measure, real value in the measure right there. Now, down here, again, if you've had any kind of performance appraisal, you recognize this. Here's stuff that you're measuring that has nothing to do with what you should be measuring. So this area down here is criterion contamination. Now, in criterion contamination, probably the biggest source, if you've had any kind of performance appraisal, is what did your supervisor think of you? How well did you get along with the supervisor? In other words, likes you a lot, you get evaluated high, and even though it had nothing to do with what you actually had done. The other thing that can happen too is that sometimes the stuff that happened right before that performance appraisal period, gets overweighted, and that can be another form of contamination. Yeah, if, let's say, where you would run into this with, let's say, some kind of clinical or counseling measure, is if you had, actually, you're more likely to end up with deficiency, but if you have something where, and this could happen with structural interviews in IO psychology, you have people evaluating other people's behavior either because it fits the job or because they think it fits the criteria for schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, And consequently, if it's some kind of protocol they're using, it might have some of this and it might also have some of their biases, or some of what you actually see. And the thing we can say, anytime people are evaluating other people's behavior, even if we're doing it in a systematic manner, we're not as infallible, or we're not, let's put it this way, there's no such thing as an infallible measure of psychology that I'm aware of, but we're less consistent than what a pencil of paper. In other words, if you want to have more of this into the conceptual criteria because it's remaining stable over time, go with the multiple choice test. What's the limitation of the multiple choice test? For just about anything.
One, you could be queuing.
Okay. So they have limited options.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that with the item analysis. Yeah, that's a good point there. That if, there's only 4 options and I kind of halfway know things, I might be able to use process elimination and give the right answer. The other thing that kind of goes in tandem with that is that idea that you've limited responses. So in other words, there's not as many different ways of addressing some kind of area as there would be where you have an open-ended test where let's say you have like an essay test, okay, where you're going to have more different varieties of answers, but then it's going to become less consistent. Now, if you have people watching behavior, people fade in, people fade out. Anybody that sat in this or any other class for hours on end, that happens, doesn't it? I'm good for about maybe 20 or 25 minutes before I have to internally start slapping myself. And I get to practice with that when I go to the conferences and people are presenting other topics. And you're kind of wishing they could speed talk, or you're wishing you could have gone to the poster session, or you're like, But anyway, so not as consistent because people can fade in, fade out. Attention spans are going to differ, and that's going to affect how much of this actually is captured. So having said that, when we get into criterion validity in a little bit more detail, there's going to be 2 problems with criterion. One of them is going to be with the test itself. The test isn't going to be a complete measure. Tests never are. Again, same principle. It doesn't matter what we're testing. If we're testing blood, we're not taking all the blood, right? Hopefully we're not doing that. Give 100% unless you're giving blood is the but yeah, we're taking that small sample. That small sample isn't going to, it should be representative of the whole, but we're going to miss some things. We take that small sample, we measure it, but we're going to miss some things. Now, when we get to talking about content validity, part of the idea is that, here's what the content domain in some area, and our test can maybe measure, and I'm going to do one of these pie charts, even though 8 weeks says not to do this, based on the logic that in terms of how the human brain interprets proportions and spectrums and stuff. But anyway, so we measured a third of something with content validity. Now this happens a lot with job tests. That until we get to that point where we have like the holodeck from Star Trek. Hey, Star Trek fans here. Well, only nerd neuro. Okay, so you have something where you can simulate something with perfect fidelity. This is going to happen, and even that would have some limitations in that if you wanted to have a perfect measure of something, you'd have to measure everything somebody did over a lifetime to be able to predict, right? Well, what are you going to predict if you measure them over a lifetime? So, content is going to be, in terms of the measure itself, even if it's content valid, it's not going to capture everything. And then there's going to be error that's going to creep into that. And then on this set, where we're talking about measuring the performance of the outcome, it's going to be deficient too. So where I'm going with that is a lot of the writers that talk about testing and validation just love criterion validity because it's a true empirical validity, which, yeah, point well taken on that. But having said that, it's going to be like any form of validity, it's going to be flawed. And again, flaws in terms of the tests are not going to be representative of everything we could measure from whatever that domain is, whether it's work performance or psychopathology, and then the criterion measures that we're going to try to validate it against. are not gonna be sufficient. And then there's something else I'll throw out too, with respect to trying to do criterion validation. I'm going to move this without a program. Okay, so you create some kind of test. Chances are, if you created a content valid test, you're going to do create some kind of rationally defined passing point. So let's say hypothetically we've got that normal distribution. We'll talk about something called the Angoff method of setting passing points and cut scores. Anybody familiar with that? If you worked with a project on Tillman, you might have done something like that, or like say NOPD, but that was a year and a half or almost 2 years, no, a year ago. Okay, so you ask subject matter experts questions about the question: what proportion of qualified people, or if we're going to do this in an educational setting, what proportion of normally achieving fourth graders could answer these math questions? If you're going to do this in a clinical or counseling setting, what proportion of people who are clinically depressed would endorse the following items? And by endorse, choose the option that indicates depression. You'd have some kind of passing. And so, typically speaking, if we're using something with a cut score passing point, we're saying, okay, at what point approaching the extreme end of a distribution are we going to say that people have whatever we're looking for, whether it's clinical pathology, whether it's job skills or certain personality characteristics. So we'll select these people. Okay? Now, if this was a hiring test, we wanted to later determine whether or not that test was predicting job performance. We would go get performance criteria. So we'd get this stuff where it is both deficient and contaminated. So we're hoping to correlate the test scores to this little area here. So we're missing some. And over and above that, we're taking this part of the distribution. Now, what does that do to the variability with respect to being able to calculate a correlation coefficient? Because what is it you're told in terms of the conceptual part of a correlation coefficient? You're standardizing those values. In other words, you're taking values from two different areas, and we can say, okay, test scores and job performance, we're going to transform those, if you want to say, into something that's going to approximate a z-value and put them on a common metric and see how they scatter. Well, basically what you've done at this point is, because you're not capturing all of the performance, who knows what you have for the real distribution of those scores, and then you've taken this and basically done that. Are you with me so far? Is this becoming gibberish? The idea is range restriction. Nothing ruins the correlation coefficient as quickly as restricted. If you're assuming continuous variables, that is whether interval or scale, and they can assume a lot of different values, nothing's going to ruin that more than constraining the range, because that's going to drive the correlation coefficient down. In other words, with the criterion validity that gets reported with a lot of stuff, unless they took everybody that took the test and then measured some kind of performance, it's going to be a lower bound estimate. Now, having said all that, we have ways of correcting for this. In other words, there are formulas that if you have, let's say, this much right here, and you're going to extrapolate and assume that that was a normal distribution, you can kind of estimate what that's going to be like. But we'll save that for later time when it's even hotter and I want to create more confusion. So you start looking at this stuff, it really isn't all that confusing. I think that's one of the things that I like about psychometrics, or like about psychology statistics, is you can take those numbers and you can attach them to things that you can see in the real world versus having like some of the theoretical or conceptual math classes where I've had over the years, where you're working out some kind of formula, and it's like it's not like anything. So if you do this to this to this times this, raise it by natural log e, oh, look what happens. I remember having moments like that when I was like a high school student or an undergraduate going, okay, yeah, so what? The other one I liked was when I was first starting to learn quadratic equations, and they're like, oh, if you do this, this forms a minimum. Like a minimum of what? This is at age 16. Okay, so you've got this happening, so what? And I think I've shared this before that when I first had like algebra classes in the pre-calc and some of the other stuff, I'm like, who the hell uses this stuff in the main book? When I end up here. Okay. Questions on that? Is that all just kind of seem questionable? Okay, I've placed a couple of things in Moodle. I've got a validity brief overview where everything is kind of concisely bullet pointed out and talking about some of the stuff. If you all would take a look at this, and I'm going to expand on this stuff between now and the end of the quarter. But here's, if you want to see the cliff notes, at least use the term crib sheet or cheat sheet. Is that even a thought? Cheat sheet didn't mean we're cheating at this method. Everything abbreviated. Although I did know people that had to use cheat sheet. People that classmates as an undergraduate who would put test answers on the inside of like the silver foil gum wrappers. So the teachers got the back turned, see the gum go to the mouth, and they're looking at the wrapper. It's like, I'm looking at them, I'm thinking, wouldn't it just been easier to study? The other thing, another time I saw a classmate sheet. She had apparently wrote answers or notes on her legs and sat in the back of the room, and apparently if she needed an answer, she pulled her skirt up and looked for the answer. I don't think she ever got caught. I don't think the instructor would want to, like, oh, I just saw you want it. Yeah, no. Yeah, even in the pre-hashtag #MeToo era that would probably screw up. Okay, so anyway, everything is summarized here. So what it is and briefly how we do it. What I'm going to do is go into some of the stuff in more detail in the upcoming class. Now, something I did want to point out here, for people, especially for people in IO, this is one of the last points, validity generalization and meta-analysis. So part of what happens with tests, especially tests that are measuring something at, let's say, a construct level, by construct level, personality characteristics, leadership, emotional intelligence, things like that. Those types of tests tend to work across situations, so we would say they're not situationally specific. On the other hand, if the test tends to measure a certain type of content domain, like necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities for police officers and firefighters, it's not necessarily measuring at the construct level. It could be asking people about knowledges, like from the perspective of having a behavior listed and then asking about that behavior. So it's going to be more content specific. Well, it could be something where it could be transported, but you'd have to show the two jobs were roughly the same. And we do that a lot. It's called transportability studies, or what we would typically gets referred to as validity generalization, the degree to which test scores can be transported across different situations. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do we mean by domains when we talk about?
Domains with what?
When we talk about
domains, yeah, domains can be anything you want to measure. So domains could be something like, we could say, okay, we want to measure clinical depression, and here's everything that characterizes clinical depression. And then part of what we would have to do if we're going to do like a content valid test is we'd have to look at that and say, okay, here's all the things that characterize clinical depression. What can we realistically measure in there, either with a pencil and paper test, with some kind of clinical behavioral observation protocols, with whatever it is we're able to measure. With the stuff that I've worked with, like firefighters and police officers, we would start by taking the behaviors, and instead of looking, just focusing on the behaviors, we would take that and we'd say, okay, here's everything that characterizes the firefighters. Flip this a minute. So here's what firefighters do. We're going to go through another process. We're going to say, okay, what type of knowledge, skills, and abilities and other things are necessary to be able to perform those behaviors. And that's where we're actually going to form the job content of that job. In other words, we're going to say, okay, here's all the knowledge, skills, abilities, other characteristics that people have to possess to be an effective firefighter. Let's get in here and figure out the best ways to measure stuff. And it's kind of a rule of thumb, the lower you are with respect to the organizational hierarchy or the more behavioral or observable the jobs are, the easier it is to create a content valid test. In other words, I could ask somebody, what they know about, let's say, operating large vehicles, what they know about water pressure. I'll give a specific example. Anybody ever handle one of those firefighting hoses? You see, like in the movies or television, or if you get to watch in real life in a big city, they'll attach the big canvas hose to the fire hydrant, and usually be like between 2 to 4 guys handling the hose. And there's a reason for that. I tried this. I tried handling the hose and turning the water on about quarter pressure. I almost went airborne and I let go of the hose. So that would be an example. You'd ask people, or ask whether or not they had good working knowledge of what happens with water pressure. Of all the jobs, that I can think of, firefighting has to be the one, at least with an urban setting, it has to be the one that's probably the most physically and cognitively demanding to put all those domains together. So anyway, what kind of reasoning skills do they need, and what are some examples of that? What kind of knowledge of firefighting equipment, knowledge of emergency medical procedures and things like that. So we start breaking that down based on the KSAOs, and then we start asking questions that determine whether or not people do or do not have any of that. Now, again, we're probably not going to be able to measure everything with the test. If for anybody that's familiar with police and fire testing, that's a multi-stage process that starts with a written test and then goes on to be able to test some of the other things. We can also put physical ability within that content. So we're going to look at everything that person needs to possess, knowledge, skills, abilities, physical abilities, licensure, and look for some way of asking questions or observing the person or sending them to a medical evaluation or a psych evaluation or whatever we need to do to be able to measure what's in that content. That work as an answer, or that just confuse things? Okay. I also get concerned that I get a little bit confused because I think that's one of the problems too. If you've been working with stuff for a long time, and I have to be cognizant of this when I'm teaching undergrad stats, is that slow down, back up, and take it in small steps, because it isn't necessarily as easy to them as it is to you, and it wasn't necessarily as easy for me now as it was when I was sitting where they were sitting. So, okay. So validity generalization, situational specificity. Let me back up on that idea of organizational hierarchy and what you would measure here. With the jobs that are at the lower level, where it's short timeline horizons, that is, the person is working from minute to hour to hour. I'm not going to do lyrics from the door song if anybody recognizes and so on. Day-to-day week. Okay, I'll stop. But jobs where you can observe what's happening and have short timeline horizons are fairly easy to develop content valid tests for. For the people that sit at the top, for the people that have a lot of cognitively complex judgmental work where they're making strategic decisions, for example, that's where you start to have to move into constructs and traits, because you're not going to be able to ask about specific knowledge areas. As a matter of fact, if you ask about specific knowledge areas, I'll give Les Geis an example. He observes how many, I'm trying to think how many faculty members there are, how many different departments. Is he necessarily a job subject matter expert for all those? And the answer is no, because that's not what we expect of him. We expect him to be able to view things from the top level and make hard strategic decisions that are going to work looking across the needs of everybody. Okay. Well, having said that, you come up with a pencil and paper test that's likely to measure that effectively. And to a certain degree, you could, but if you're really going to measure that effectively, you would probably get into personality traits and things related to cognitive complexity information processing and strategic decision making, which becomes very constructual and not and perhaps not real behavioral when you look at it. Now, having said that, can you develop tests for less dices and people like that? Yeah, you can. A little bit harder development, a little bit more, at least from my experience, a little bit more empirical work. Would we do that? Create a test like that for Dr. Nice? No, because there's only one person in this position. On the other hand, if we had, 10 people like him and potentially 100 candidates every other year, yeah, it might actually be worth doing. Okay, item analysis and distractor analysis. Fun stuff. I think so. With respect to looking at test items, there's a bit of math that we'll do to try to determine whether or not the items are doing what it is we need them to do. And there's also at times we have to look at whether or not the items are working among groups or between groups. Now, one of the things I posted in there is an activity, if you all look between now and the next time we meet, is the article by Claude, interview with Claude Steele from Frontline from Public Broadcasting. And it makes a good point about what can happen when we have people from different groups, and let's say there's differential pressures in terms of being able to perform well in the test. And we do this, this happens a lot, or it has happened a lot. I've mentioned this before with women in math tests. In other words, we start the test off with, okay, ladies, this test is designed to demonstrate that you don't have the same skill and ability with math as men do. And we can turn that into self-fulfilling prophecy. And it appears this has happened over the course of, almost a century or more with minority groups, in particular African American groups, where the stereotype is that they can't perform as well intellectually. And then we find ways of reducing the pressure, especially if we can get that pressure reduced off of people where we're not reinforcing that stereotype of underperformance starting with kindergarten, and things kind of equalize. I mentioned that before with women. We take, for example, we take girls and guys, we put them in segregated math and science classes. What will happen is by the time you hit age 16 or 17, the math and science performance is going to be the same. If we keep men and women, or girls and boys in the same classes, what happens is women will typically underperform, and there's a lot of explanations for that, including their stereotype threat that Claude Steele talks about. The other thing has to do with behavioral norms and how people act, and how is it that if anybody can think back to about 6th grade, how do guys start to act differently than girls? Who's more aggressive in dominating that classroom conversation? Somebody's asking science questions, and typically it's the guys. So what happens is you've got half the population being cut out of the conversation and disengaging and perhaps not learning as much. Again, if we segregate, then the performance seems to stay the same. The problem with segregated classrooms is, given United States law and culture, things like that, it does not go over well, even when it could work. Yeah, and by the time I was at 9th grade, I don't think I'd wanted to segregate, but not people really. Anyway, item analysis. The effectiveness, we score the exam and sort the results by score. We can do something called a discrimination index. Now, the example I have here, this is one where you could just do this with a hand calculator if you have a set of scores. The one I typically use if I'm doing item analysis to see how well that item is discriminating is going to be the biserial and the point by serial correlations. So discrimination index, the idea here is to see whether the items are workings for the exam, select an equal number of examinees, like split that group of examinees into fourths, take the top fourth and the bottom fourth and compare the proportion out of both fourths in terms of who got the item right. And what should happen is you should end up where that proportion of people that in the top 25% is a higher proportion getting that item right. That makes sense? In other words, if that test is measuring what it's supposed to be testing, the higher scoring people should have been more likely to get an item right. Now, kind of point out what's happening here is we get to talk about item response theory. Item response theory has something called local independence, which means we're taking the item out of the test and we're just comparing it to the characteristic of interest. With this, we're taking and comparing the proportions that got the item correct to the whole test. So we have no local independence here. Well, so what? This type of indices is going to work okay if it's going to be a one-time only use test. It's going to be something where it's going to be small numbers, and this will help you easily quantify it. If it's a test or test items, we're going to be using them over time. We want to get real precise with what's happening with that item. That's where you need item response theory. Now, the problem with item response theory, we'll get to this a little bit later, is that you need to have a minimum of 300 observations to be able to do the simplest form of IRQ. Any well-written test, the proportion of examinees in the upper group should have selected the correct answer. A greater proportion of examinees in the lower group should have selected one of the distractors. Now, that idea of eliminating the columns, talking about where people can use process elimination, that becomes a bit problematic with distractors. Let's say I have So I've got a multiple choice item, and I've got options A, B, C, D, 1. And let's say with this example, option C is correct, and 40% or 0.4 proportion get that item correct. What should it look like? What should the remaining distribution look like on this distraction? What proportion on each one of those? Yeah. In other words, if those distractors are doing what they're doing, it should be something like that. Now, if you have a situation where it looks more like this, the probability of getting the correct answer is no longer 0.40 because people were able to eliminate those, so it's probably, and that would elevate the guessing parameter in terms of who got that. So at this point, you might not know how difficult that item truly is. So one of the things we talk about if we're going to reuse a test is we'll take a look at the distractors and make sure all the distractors are functioning. What's the key, or what's the rule for writing good distractors? If you're going to write good distractors, it should look, and this kind of a good practice, it should look logical enough to somebody that kind of has superficial knowledge of whatever the topic is. If it doesn't, if it's where they can eliminate it by process of elimination, that's what's going to be problematic. And that happens quite a bit, doesn't it? Or if you have take a test where some instructor wrote the test, all of the above, none of the above, right? So sometimes what those can do is process of elimination. So we look at it and say, well, it has to be at least one of these, but I don't think it's all of these, and select. Or eliminate and identify the correct answer. Okay, so greater proportion of examinees lower group should have selected a distractor. Hopefully what they did was, when you go to look at the items, equal distribution of the remaining people who didn't select the correct answer are distributed across. Some basic definitions here. Difficult items, moderate items, and low difficulty items. Now what this is here is the proportion of people that are getting the item correct. What happened when you took the GRE test? Where was it difficulty-wise? It was aiming for this, but what it was doing, if what I was told about how ETS sets that stuff up, that spiraling omnibus format where it was kind of rotating, moving through these with the idea of coming back to this and finding out at what level, of something like that would kind of max out. So easy items, 80% or more get them correct. 30% or less get items correct. If we're looking for items to have maximum discrimination, right here, 0.5. So half the people get it correct, half the people get it incorrect. These are going to be the items that generate the best variance, going to generate the best metrics with respect to determining who knows something or doesn't know something, who has what kind of talent or ability, who has what kind of psychopathology. They're going to be the ones with maximum discrimination. And if you think about this mathematically, it kind of makes sense, because if you're going to do something where you're going to calculate the variance, using zeros and ones. Let's see if this makes any sense. Based on binomial expansion, it's going to be that halfway point. It's going to, we had a bunch of items where it was the halfway point. Half the people are getting correct, half the people are getting them incorrect. Those are the ones that are going to have that. Now, do we do that with tests? I wouldn't do that in undergraduate class. I wouldn't do it in grad class either, but I was administering multiple choice items. What's the problem with doing that? Where half the people pass the test, half the people don't pass the test or get the items correct, the other half get it incorrect? Think about this in terms of motivation to take the test. What happens to your motivation if you feel like you're getting a lot of items wrong? And I think that happens with a lot of standardized tests, certainly with the GRE test. Anybody not leave that room feeling good? Yeah. Smart people, right? But yeah, so you kind of walked out of that with sort of maybe a bit motivational experience. And if I did that like in an undergraduate class where instead of having like a 70% cut score, it was like Z scores, and I was going to use that kind of scaling, it would be pretty demotivational. Now, when we do this with employment testing, what we're often careful to do is we'll set passing point based on what proportion of people on average get the items correct, and we'll scale that so it equals 70, regardless of how many items are on the test. And it's the same, that idea that if we're not trying to completely demoralize people, we have to give them numeric feedback in some fashion that people use. What about really easy tests? Anything wrong with real easy tests? There are going to be some tests where I'm not going to get good item statistics. Is that going to be okay? Or some kinds of tests, I think I've mentioned this before, some kind of tests where it's okay if everybody 90% or more get the test correct, or 100% get everything correct. We have a name for that. Mastery. So if I'm testing for mastery, that's what should happen in a grad class. That in theory, what we have with y'all is we got the top end of the distribution, so we're not going to try to artificially impose some kind of bell curve. And if you've been doing the readings and paying attention to stuff and focusing on what you need to be focusing on, chances are you should walk out of the it should be real easy for the instructor, because the instructor's going to look and say, oh, there it is, yeah. And consequently, you're going to have a constrained range, and you're not going to be able to generate good item statistics. Now, what I'm going to do here with the first exam is y'all are going to get some multiple choice questions. So this is going to be my attempt to go. I'm going to go over the item statistics we'll talk about. So if we're going to administer some kind of training program in some kind of workplace setting, well, when we're done with that training program, we're kind of hoping everybody gets 100%, and not necessarily concerned about whether or not we can generate good item statistics to tell us how much something is discriminating. The other hand, when we're doing testing, and one of my favorite things when I used to talk to public groups about testing was, say something that sounds a little bit controversial, like, yeah, I'm really into discrimination. I think discrimination is good. Wall Street movie with pardon? The Wall Street with Douglas's son, Michael Douglas. Yeah, Roman Jacko. I was thinking about this because Wall Street mentioned it last week. Greed is good, right? So I kind of walk in like discrimination is good. And people are like, because of the connotation of the word, people hear discrimination, they're thinking racial discrimination, gender discrimination, things like that. It's like, no, using some kind of assessment to be able to differentiate people in terms of whatever it is you're trying to measure, whether it's job skills or whether it's psychopathology or personality characteristics. Well, in some cases, we're going to have examples of tests that aren't set up to discriminate, but determine whether or not people master it. So, okay, real quickly here. If we're assuming 50 examinees and number that got a correct answer using that same type of scaling, well, 30 or less is going to be a high difficulty item, 90 or more low difficulty item. Again, it's the items that are like this one that are going to have the maximum discrimination. But then we're not also interested in something that's going to produce maximum discrimination. Sometimes we also have to consider the psychological characteristics of the person taking the test. I thought about that, like with an undergraduate class teaching undergraduate statistics or testing, and I could come up with a test that's going to be, like within this range. That kind of implies that some people are going to get low scores, or people are going to be looking at items and like not knowing the answer, getting frustrated, and not being motivated to complete the test. I remember that happening years ago, like undergraduate years, somebody didn't prep for a test. I remember the people, I remember seeing people get up and walk out of the test. If it's something where that measurement's going to be important, you might also want to think about, the psychological characteristics to keep people motivated and engaged to complete that test. Okay, so anyway, kind of answer this. Is a test that nobody failed too easy? Well, if it's mastery, or if you're testing a group of people to see if they're, psychologically within normal functioning, and failing the test means you don't possess some kind of psychopathology, it could actually be good. Now the problem with that again is that if we're doing item analysis, it isn't going to necessarily generate perfect item statistics so we can walk into a conference and present and say, oh, look at scaling and look at what happened with this test. A test in which nobody gets 100%. Well, it'd be just about every undergraduate test I've ever given. Nobody ever gets 100%. On the other hand, if it's a test where nobody passes, it's going to depend on what you're screening. I've been in those situations where it administered some kind of employment test, and nobody passed the test, and kind of glad for that. Those kind of situations tend to happen when, let's say, the job market is tight and a lot of unemployed people. And that's kind of not what we're dealing with right now, right? There's more jobs than there are people, and one of the concerns is with respect to the people that are my age, older, retiring, is that there's just not enough people coming up to fill those jobs. So full employment for younger people. I think about that like the last two presidential administrations, when we want to talk about how they reduced unemployment. It's like, no, you guys didn't do that. Demographics did that. Right? Okay, should items that are too easy or too difficult be thrown out? Again, if we're going to think of this in terms of the test taker and keeping people motivated, perhaps not. Sometimes, if you're going to create that content valid job test, you're going to have items that are going to be mixed in terms of either the difficulty of the item, or the other thing you don't know about this too is because this is going to be sample specific and testing situation specific. Are these items hard, or is your group of examinees lacking something, or the easy, not easy, but you have a well qualified group. Basically, what I try to do to kind of build in discrimination and keep people motivated is to kind of vary the difficulty level if I'm going to reuse items. Okay, so generally examinees who did well in the exam should select the correct answer. And again, the discrimination index, and the discrimination index identifies the relationship between the item and whatever's being measured. Examinees who did well should be able to distinguish or tell you how well that test item is distinguishing high performance from low. So this is where I get into the biserial, point biserial correlation. Now, when you all had your first stat class and talked about correlation, what were you told about correlation? You had to have two distributions of continuously distributed variables. Is that kind of where they came from, how they approached it? That sound right? Yeah, well, guess what? They lied to you. With correlation, you could have a continuously distributed variable. You could have rank ordered variables. You could have two sets of rank ordered variables. You could have a dichotomous variable and a continuous variable. We have that dichotomous variable. That's what we talk about as being biserial or point biserial correlation. In other words, what you're doing with these types, and the difference here is that one assumes that it's strictly 0, 1. The other assumes that you might have had 4 options, but in terms of how you're going to score it, it's going to be 0, 1. So the term that's used is you're going to artificially dichotomize the range. But anyway, you take the 0, 1s and you correlate them with the score. So if you had other types of classes where you looked at logistic functions, this would be like a bit like logistic regression. 0, 1, and then what does the continuous variable look like compared to the 0, 1? And the basic idea is that people from either were in one group or group that got the item right or got the item incorrect, how well do their scores correlate based on that kind of information. And so consequently, what should happen with these biserial correlations is if that item is doing what it's supposed to be doing, if it's measuring correctly, getting that item correct should correlate. That is that, correlate with total score. Biserial correlations is getting the item correct, correlate with total score. Now, if we're going to put this in a personality measurement or assessment context, or psychopathology assessment context, does getting that item right correlate, or endorsing that item the key direction, the term, key direction, right? In other words, if you took a test with logic, you took the NEO2, there isn't a right or wrong answer. It's just, did you endorse it in a way that indicates introversion, extroversion, agreeableness, or whatever? So endorsing the item, the key direction should correlate with the total score on whatever that measure is. The thing that's kind of nice to do with like the difficulty levels or those discrimination indices or these biserial correlations is if you don't have hundreds or thousands of observations and you want to take a look at the items and say, okay, is the differential item function going on here? Well, I can compare the discrimination indices or even the difficulty levels to groups on any item. And if there's some differences there, then it's going to indicate, flip this around. An acronym that I've used a little bit too much lately, some of the stuff I've been working on. Yeah, differential item function. So does that item function different? That is there differences between two groups in terms of who gets that item correct? Or if we're looking at some kind of, let's say, measure of depression or bipolar disorder, with respect to who endorses it in the key direction, do women differ from men? Do upper SES people differ from lower SES people, socioeconomic status people, things like that? There's differences by race or ethnicity. And that's kind of the point where you're looking at that and saying, okay, red flag with this item, the difficulty level or the biserial correlations between two groups were different. So consequently, I need to take a look at this and ask see if I can figure out whether those are really true between the differences, or do I have something where that item is somehow biased? In other words, if an item, and again, differential item function means it's functioning different, plain and simple. It doesn't become bias until I can make the conclusion that the people that were taking the test or responding to the item were essentially equivalent with whatever was being measured, but they're producing two different scores. So kind of two different things. Differential item function, again, something's happening here, the groups are different. We're not sure why. Bias is when we have a problem. Bias is when the measure is becoming contaminated or the measure may not be usable for certain groups or for all groups. Oh, with respect to correlation. Now, you could have a situation where you have that dichotomously scored variable, and instead of having the test scores, you could put the rank on the test, so you could do kind of like a biserial Spearman's row. Spearman's row is when you correlate through rank order this. You could also, and again, when I said they lied to you about continuous variables, you could take that and take a look at whether or not they got the item correct or incorrect, and then whether or not they passed or didn't pass the test. So you've got two sets of 0 1s. We call it a P coefficient, form of correlation. How often would I use something like that? Probably not really often, because by the time you start eliminating, reducing the scale of measurement, you could start to have information loss. In other words, I'm going to get more information if I score whether or not or take a look at that item and determine whether or not getting that item correct correlated with total score versus whether or not they pass or fail. That's, in some circumstances that could be useful. The thing with some of those forms of regression correlation is like the P coefficient is something you calculate easily without a handheld calculator or computer. Now that we all have computers, we're doing a lot of stuff now with complex forms. Ordinary least squares and parametric statistics, but also infinite statistics. Yeah, I'm kind of told that if, let's say, you had a class, you did a psychology PhD program in the 50s or 60s, the multivariate stat class would have been talking about what the statistics were, and you wouldn't have actually performed any of them. And kind of leads this discussion too, where people will sometimes pull up the 8th grade, the Kansas State 8th grade test from 1856, and they'll say, "Oh, look at what those people had, how much those people had to know years ago." Well, if you kind of look at what it was that they did know, it wasn't a whole lot of breadth of content there, and it wasn't always in great detail across this content. So if you think people are becoming dumber, less educated, no, it's just the nature of what we know and what we learn is completely different. It's completely different, but it's changed quite a bit over time. Yeah, if you want to see something interesting, Google the rural Midwestern state 8th grade test from the 19th century, and then see if you can answer the questions about egg production, and this is what's going on outside. What's the weather going to do next? And how much tack you need to give the horses at certain times, things like that. Okay, so anyway, discrimination indices. Each item between the performance of examiners who did well and who didn't do well, the idea that these should be positive values if that item is functioning as it should within the context of the test. Now, some other things can happen where we have what we think is a homogeneous test. We come up with a bunch of negative discrimination indices or negative point biserial correlations, and that can happen when that item is measuring something completely different from what the rest of the test is. In other words, I give you a test of U.S. history and I throw in math questions. So I've got 30 questions that are about history or literature, and then just to have some fun, I throw in 4 or 5 algebra questions. Well, it's likely those 4 or 5 algebra questions aren't going to correlate with the total score. Most of that total score is being driven by the people that can answer the history or the English lit or the other types of questions. That makes sense? So when you do end up with a negative biserial correlations or end up with negative or backwards looking discrimination indices. Could mean something's wrong with that item. Could mean perhaps that item doesn't belong with the rest of the items. When I get the results back from a multiple choice test, let's say I had something where a couple items look something like this with that are zero correlation. Oh, we got a Murphy visit.
And Derek has locked himself out of the office.
I need your keys, man.
Let's bring Murphy over here. Let's put Murphy on camera. There we go.
Hey, Murphy!
Hey,
Murphy!
Oh no, Ollie.
Say, Colin, and now you love it. Cookie.
I remember.
Oh, I remember.
Are we just making the round?
Yeah. Okay, so we've done some Murphy assessment. So anyway, the discrimination indices, regardless of whether you're calculating those proportions or you're doing it by serial correlation, it's going to range from -1 to 1, just like most of the coefficients that we deal with. And where I was, we just have put Murphy at a desk. Situation where I had something like this appear on item analysis. So what I have here is the point by serial correlation equals -0.4. Chances are, if it was a test where I'm measuring the same thing, and this occurs, what this means is that I miskeyed the item when I put together the keys, put together the scan sheet score, or my scoring program is off a little bit. Yeah, Murphy's kind of mellowed out over the last year. Yeah, she used to, like, she'd come into my office and then she'd stop and I'd get up and she'd run. She's in there looking to see if I've got food crumbs on the floor and I haven't been. Okay, so what is a good value? Well, basically, we're hoping that it's going to be somewhere, within that middle range for a really good item. This would be true of items that would be on the GRE test or a lot of standardized tests. With a lot of the classroom tests, especially with undergraduates, they're going to fall all over this range. Generally, I don't worry about that because some of the stuff, again, if it comes up easy, it's stuff I'm hoping people mastered. When stuff comes up like in let's say where it's not really discriminating and the discrimination index starts to approach 0, again, I'm hoping that's happening because more people are getting it correct. So in other words, let's say an item has a difficulty level of 1.0 or 9.0, 90% of the people are getting it correct. Chances are it's not going to produce a really good discrimination indices, whether using that calculated in fourths or you're looking at the biserial correlation. Like, if the difficulty item of the level of an item was 1.0, that is, everybody got it correct, that biserial correlation or the discrimination indices is going to be 0. When it comes up as being negative, ask whether that test or that item fits with that test, or whether you somehow, with the scoring program, you've misscored the item. And this can also happen too if you were using some kind of clinical pathology measure, where you could have, if let's say you miskeyed an item or the item wasn't really measuring what you thought it was measuring, it could end up producing a negative biserial correlation or negative discrimination indices coefficient. So item discrimination, a quick example, 90% in the upper quarter get it right, 20% the lower quarter get it right. You calculate that proportion 0.70. So a pretty good discriminating item. Next one, not so much. So you've got 80 in the upper quarter, of test takers and 80% and 70%. The next one, this will illustrate that idea if everybody gets the item right, and again, it doesn't, just the opposite. If only 100% of the upper quarter and nobody in the lower quarter gets it correct, that's as good as it gets. This is the one where I say, okay, this will illustrate that idea that if everybody's getting the item right, it doesn't matter if you do an item discrimination index or you do by serial correlation, it's going to come up. 50 and 50, again, 0, because equal proportions are getting it right, both the top and the bottom group. And this one here, this is where you get concerned. Because let's say this is like a knowledge-based item, what's happening here is that people that aren't scoring well on the test are more likely to get that item correct. So then, is it miskey, or is it a bad item, or is it special knowledge that's only possessed by the lower quarter class? Now, that's kind of, so, factors that contribute to how an item discriminates between two groups of students or examinees. The positive, okay, so factors. Easy item, not easy item. Even though it isn't as the presentation bias, item bias of some kind.
Or what about like in math where, if for example, if I were to help my 6th grade and then do their math problem, some of that math I haven't seen in ages, so the way they're working it out would be completely different than
Okay.
I normally would have, or maybe it's just part of like a just as math person is geometry.
Geometry,
I don't know.
yeah.
So, that could be considered lower level, but then you could give me differential equations or something.
Or maybe by some chance you knew the differential equation, but you couldn't remember the basic geometry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, yeah, something like that, where you have some kind of anomalies among people. Low item discrimination. Certainly if everybody's getting the item correct, make a difference. Negative discrimination indices, again, what are you going to look for if you see this? The two big things are, is that item really measuring what the rest of the test is measuring? Or is there something wrong? Well, let's add a third one in here. Is there something wrong with how the item is worded so that the people that would be higher with whatever the characteristic would be, whether it was knowledge or let's say it was some kind of psychopathological condition like depression or bipolar disorders or something that caused people to misinterpret the item? And then, if I'm doing this with an undergraduate class, then did I fill out the key correct? Was my score correct? Quick reference, and this is, again, it doesn't matter if we're doing that calculation using the bottom quarter, the top quarter, if we're doing it by serial correlation. The values are going to be roughly the same if we have, again, where it's a high difficulty item and it's 0, medium difficulty, or low difficulty. We're going to review it. If it's something where it's medium difficulty item and it's producing up to 30% or point by serial equals 0.30, okay. If it's high, okay. If it's low, and again, the difficulty is going to constrain the rate. So if it's too high difficulty or too low difficulty, that's going to constrain that variance. That's not going to produce the biggest correlation coefficient. On the other hand, if it's medium difficulty, then it should be okay. And if it's above 30% or by serial correlation of 0.30, generally speaking, you're going to be okay regardless of whether it's high, medium, or low. So the idea of distract analysis, we talked about this before, where if, let's say, we're going to try to estimate the difficulty of the item based on how many people get the correct option right. What should happen with the people who don't get the correct answers, people should be, or the responses should be distributed equally over the distractor. If that starts changing kind of significantly, then we have a problem, because basically it's kind of indicating that by process of elimination, people are more likely to get the correct response. So a couple examples here, item 1 and item 2, the proportion of examinees in the upper quarter and the bottom quarter that are getting the item correct, and then how they're distributed across the options. So with the first one, that wouldn't be too bad. You have 15% in the upper quarter, 25. If you look at what's happening, the bottom quarter here, yeah, maybe nobody's choosing E, but it's fairly evenly distributed. Same thing with the middle, where you have 15 getting it correct, and then kind of evenly distributed across the other 4 options. The one that would be kind of problematic here, or the second one here, upper quarter. If you see what's happening with the pattern, nobody's choosing A and E, and that could be okay. When you get down to the middle and the bottom, that's where you want to see more of it distributed equally across the time. Again, the perfect distractors like people. Was Mike doing that, or maybe shut the sound off on this?
That noise is very painful.
There we go. Okay, I think we're live again.
Yes, we are.
Okay. Okay, so the purpose of a good distractor, again, kind of a rule of thumb. When you're writing distractors, make sure that they seem at least logically plausible, either based on the item stem or based on how you would picture somebody having superficial knowledge of the content of, if it was a knowledge or a skill-based test. Distractors you should consider throwing out. Well, if they're not functioning, if nobody's endorsing that distractor, usually an indicator that it's probably a good time to develop another distractor. And I've done this with law enforcement tests and other job selection measures where, over 2 successive testings, you didn't have people choosing certain options, and that's where you try to replace them with something that certain people actually, that'll actually get endorsed at least part of the time. Now, when I go to the testing center at Tech, I get something back that looks like this. What I used to do was ask them for a data file, like getting an ASCII file, so I could pull it into SAS or SPSS and do my own point by serial correlations. Well, they don't have that available anymore. So what I would do is look at what they give me for output. In this case, item discrimination index and point by serial correlation, very close to the same value within, let's say, what I would call double precision rounding error. What double precision rounding error is that with the computer programs, most of them are going to carry the decimal places out 16 decimal places out and do the calculations that way. And over successive calculations, that could add up to be a little bit of a difference in some cases. The correct option indicated on this, and then who selected it. If you look at what's happening here, I've got some distractors that aren't functioning. A biserial correlation, again, that's my favorite one to use just because it's a little bit more exact, and it's also a better indicator in terms of whether or not that item fits with the test. Some of the work I've been doing recently, I had a data set back from the New Orleans Police Department with the testing we developed for them, and went through a process like this, actually sourced some of it out to the grad students and then looked at it afterwards. And made some determinations in terms of what was working, what wasn't working. In some cases, we were looking at the biserial correlation differences between two groups. There's a process called Fisher's R-to-Z transformation, which we'll talk about at a later date, where you can t-test two correlation coefficients and determine whether they're different, which is really handy if you're trying to determine whether or not you have differential item functioning with something like that. Now, again, that isn't just going to work with job tests. It could also work with any kind of trait or characteristic test to make sure that that measure is functioning the same between groups as it does overall. So, yeah, we're not going to do this, but reviewing item statistics. The first pass is taking a look at the difficulty levels and look for any occurrences where you have everybody getting an item correct or nobody getting an item correct, you weren't expecting it, then looking at the biserial correlations. And then if there's concerns with differential item function, possible item bias, that's where you go in and do the same calculations between two groups and see if there's a difference in those difficulty levels among groups. Basically speaking, if they're very close, if they're within 2 or 3 tenths with respect to that difficulty level, and one group is big and one group is small, you're not going to worry about it. On the other hand, if it was a situation where one group is at the difficulty level is 0.9, that is, it's easy for them, the others at 0.2, then those are the ones that are going to get attention. And then the biserial correlations. We could calculate the biserial correlations to make sure that between, well, say among 2 or more groups, the correlations are roughly the same. Now again, later class we'll do the Fisher's R-to-Z transformation that would allow you to test those items for statistically significant differences. And then the other thing we'll talk about that too is anytime you're told about statistics, or anytime anybody asks to do any kind of statistical calculation, the idea was, be cautious about a type 1 error. Do ANOVA instead of multiple t-tests because you don't want to increase the probability of type 1 error. Well, when we're doing this with testing, we're looking at differential item functioning. We'll do just the opposite. If we're going to try to err on the side of caution, we'll inflate the living daylights out of that type 1 error just to see if there's any possibility. Now, with respect to something we've done biserial correlations to determine whether or not you have differential item function, the next step with that is usually if you have something where it looks like differential item function, you sit down with subject matter experts or social linguists or whoever and try to see if whether or not it appears you have real world between group differences or if it really is biased. So, do y'all want to take a quick break, 5-minute break, and then we'll reconvene and we'll talk about IRT. I'm just going to leave the video feed go because I'm afraid of what could happen if I stop it.
I'll just transfer it to your bank. Like, let's just make this easier. Stop. Stop. By the pool. That's funny.
One fucking desk. We don't like your phone is probably going to blow up whenever you turn it on or whatever. Bitch, you could have texted you were in class. I had the phone on desk face down because I'm a good soldier. Because you're a good boy. I'm a good soldier. Goddamn good boys. And lo and behold, several calls, multiple text messages. You know, I thought just the way. Let's see, like after we had a project. Give me the door handle. Fuck. Oh, it's fine. I'll just have these headphones in. Nah. Fuck. These headphones are really loud. Look out over there. Fuck. Well, can I cry now? For the comfort of my own home.
I really like. I have to finish data now. I have to finish identity project. It's fine. I can just talk to you all right now. I just need to fix something. But so I have to do like 4 more data sets and put it in the report. You know, we have all the consulting ratings. And there's something else. Oh, the career fucking development plan. I don't know what I want to do one day. I just want to like make it through the weekend. And then I have to drive home for Eve's wedding. Oh, I haven't gotten bridal dress from either yet. So that's how that's going. Oh no, my friend didn't. Oh yeah. I'm a horrible bridesmaid. Oh my god.
Oh yeah.
I don't tell her all the details because she was literally having to do that.
I have to. I'm gonna be a bridesmaid for 20.
Really.
I don't really. Do you know the good things here? Yeah.
What's really called?
Maybe after all this.
And after I would be good. That's what
I was thinking of $1,000.
yeah.
Well,
This
then
lady's
you'll find me what
really
you want,
not
you know?
crazy. This lady's not going to have it.
What? How much is your bottom of It's obviously not that expensive.
Yeah.
That is true.
I still ate that week.
So expensive.
I still ate that week. I don't know.
Oh, it does have.
I want to break the back and I just twice. I'm gonna feel like
What?
I'm in a wedding on Saturday and I haven't gotten it yet.
Yeah, I have a wedding and I've not gotten the dress for it. And
I'm driving, when we get to Mobile, I'm driving straight to the seamstress's house.
I did that for a prom once.
Really?
Yeah, the seamstress wanted to tell me, but.
So I used to work for my grandmother, so she was pretty nice.
I thought mine was easy, like, when you were
Laughing and crying.
Oh, she told me that too. I think it might have been like how much.
that was just my
No, I'm not gonna be. Or when we all got our nails done after we got prom.
Yep.
We're hating that out.
Don't know how many places I've been kicked out of with an expired license because they don't believe I'm over 21.
You're going to roll with it as the only guy in the cohort.
I hope they
Contribute what you can.
Or if you're calling, then everybody, all the people at Lawrence think you're a new space.
Here. This is better directly observed than explained.
It's always awkward with, like, you know, when we're on conferences and everyone's from different states and so we all show our ID. And it's just like,
Everywhere
like a
that-
group of
Everywhere that Kevin and I go, we're from Washington and Michigan. They're like,
Not a damn.
Here.
I'm like, I don't really want to explain this.
And then a lot of
Hi,
places
we're lost.
start
We really
carrying
need
a
to
real ID or whatever. What is the ID? We have to get a real ID because the Louisiana license doesn't count.
I don't know.
So I was kind of concerned about that because I remember a couple of years ago that came up. I remember traveling, even when I was within the United States, traveling with my passport because that constituted a real ID.
Somebody, I need someone to explain this to me. So I understand that when your license is expired, like you should not be driving because it's a driver's license. But how can it
Yeah, it's
not
an ID,
prove that
yeah.
you are over 21?
Yeah.
Pisses me off.
Mallory, you look so much different right now.
Yeah, it's just like, why can that not prove? I mean, I have this lady not want to sell me beer, but I got past TSA in Dallas and Orlando. So.
Got him.
And I even told her that too before.
Sometimes it just be that way.
You should be like, you realize you're being worse than TSA right now, and that's a really, really hard.
It's just because they think that you gave your, like, the idea that you have is.
Yeah, that they used to happen a lot when I
She
was in
looked
high
at
school.
it. I mean,
People get older relatives like IDs and driver's license.
What about, what if they show you your back ID?
And actually, my friend Nettie took her sister's license once, and when they questioned her picture, she just said she lost a lot of weight, and they believed it.
Yeah, this diet.
One fascinating story about that lawsuit stuff. Is that you get, like, if you're in, like, involved in a crime and you give someone that ID.
David.
Sorry, I'm working in class with, like,
Okay. So this presentation might be a little bit misnamed. 42 slides, and I'm calling it a brief overview, but in terms of what you can talk about IRT. And what we'll do with this is we'll go to about 8 o'clock, and then I'll call time to wherever we're at. Next week we don't meet, or this is the one class that doesn't meet. If I understand the schedule correctly, it's only people who have class in the 4th that get a day off, and people in the 3rd and the 5th don't.
I was just waiting for you to say something like classes were resumed on the 4th at like 5 or something.
I checked that out. You know, and realistically, with this one, I usually like to go out and watch the fireworks. And trying to get here on the 4th, trying to get down Cook Road and get to campus, lots of luck between like 3 to 8. This is well, they canceled it even if they didn't have to. Yeah, the other cool place to be this next weekend is a bunch of us are going out on Lake Carbona in kayaks and we're going to watch the Farmerville fireworks. So Saturday the 8th. That'd be kind of fun. Go to Stephanie's house. We're going to watch at Stephanie's house the next day. Or we can see like that other Farmerville bridge. That'd be kind of fun. But then, of course, to do that, we have to have all this, we have to put special DNR for lights and the kayaks and everything. So classical test theory statistics, this is what we're talking about. Classical test theory, classical true score theory, whatever you want to call it. The prevalent way of doing examining items for probably well into a century. Then we have this other area called item response theory that emerges. Item response theory has actually been around for a long time. It's just that without, this is what I was saying earlier, without the technology, it's hard to do some types of calculations by hand. And, the first computers that were used in North America were mechanical computers. In 1947, this theory ran Univac, which I saw a mock-up of one time. It was like vacuum tubes that were taking up this whole room, and it had all the power of a handheld calculator. This is 1947. So that changes over time. And by the time we get into the 1970s, people are having access to computers, research institutions and organizations. By the 1980s, by 1988, I had my first one, which is a long time, right? A long time ago, 30 years ago. So, things have changed a lot for the last 30 years. I had a Commodore Amiga, which was like state of the art at the time. Yeah, but the cool part about it was that I had the means to be able to do some of this complex math. And I started off as a young undergraduate doing it by hand or with a handheld calculator. So anyway, the classical two-score theory, classical test theory, statistics at difficulty level, that discrimination indices, whether you're going to do it by biserial correlations or with just that upper quarter, bottom quarter proportions, the reliability. Now we talked about reliability. What kind of reliability would go along with this? If we're talking about the correlation with the total test score, whether or not that test score is measuring the same thing, what reliability would that be? Not everybody all knows, right? Internal consistency, the coefficient of alpha. So that would be an example of classical two-score theory, because basically it's telling you how much of that item set or how much of those items overlapping and measuring the same thing. And then, whatever it isn't measuring, the rest of that's going to be some form of sort of error. Now, with any of these, you want to look at differential item function, difficulty works, discrimination indices, especially if you want to do that Fisher's-Ardicy transformation, which again, we'll talk about that later, or doing the coefficient alpha. Two different groups produce two different coefficients alphas. Coefficients alpha, yeah. Putting the S all over the place. Okay, so if you have something like that where there's two sets of reliability, that's where you might also ask, okay, within these two tests, so these things somehow biased, or people interpreting these things differently, do we have some kind of differential test? Okay. So I said I would refrain from the jokes about Baroque and Romantic test analysis, classical test analysis. Right, so this would have been Beethoven, but Bach would have been performing Baroque. Okay. I can tell how funny that was. Just by the sound of the room. Statistics are generated to generalize to similar groups taking a similar test, and they only apply to that specific group. When we have something that's going to be test-specific, going to be situation-specific, the good part about this is why this branch of statistics hasn't been replaced by latent trait, by IRT statistics, is it still works, it still provides some kinds of information, and if we're dealing with less than 300 observations, it might be the only option that it's going to be tracking. So we're taking a look at the test and how do the items function within the context of that whole test. With this, what happens with latent traits looks at beyond the test to look at how well an item is measuring and what's happening with that item as it measures some kind of underlying characteristic. And then the idea is that this is going to be item level, that instead of, we have no local dependency. The item has to be interpreted in the context of the test. With this, we can interpret each item one by one compared to whatever it is we're supposed to measure. Now, the first question should be with this is, okay, so how do you get that if it's coming from test data? If one test, you've administered it to, let's say, anywhere from 300 to 300,000 people, and you're going to use this. So how do you get that latent trait stuff? Kind of what happens is if we look at variances generated by items. So let's say we're putting items in a mix, we're doing that internal consistency. So within what constitutes that internal consistency coefficient, we would have, each item would have, items I through J would have variation that they would share with other items, plus variance that would be unique to that item, plus error variance. Okay, so we're breaking it down. What's driving the numbers that the item or the patterns that item is producing? Variance that it shares with other items. Variance that's unique only to that item, but is an error, and then error. And basically what happens with factor analysis or item response theory is it's going to take all that shared variance. It's going to be shared across the items. And the mathematical assumption is that if that's being shared across those items, this means that this is the underlying thing, the construct, the trait that it's measured. So that's why the latent trait. We're not looking at the superficial level of what that item appears to be measuring, although we could do that. What we're looking at is what is the common pool of variance that these items share. Sometimes in factor analysis, we refer to that as commonality. With a U, that's a U that's not about commonality variance, shared variation. Which, again, if they're sharing variance, if they have internal consistency that's being driven, and it would have to be driven by that, that is going to represent your underlying trait or characteristic. Where this gets a little bit counterintuitive and backwards is sometimes you're going to have items where they share variance, but you're not clear on what it is that they're measuring. Now, when we talk about factor analysis, that's what we're going to be doing. We'll have groups of items that intercorrelate highly, and hypothetical. If we had like a 100-item set, let's say we had, out of that 100-item set, we came up with three groupings of items that intercorrelated highly, and those three groupings are different. Well, the mathematical assumption is that we're measuring the same thing because they're sharing something because they intercorrelate. But what they're sharing, or what you call it, you have to take a look at the items and get some kind of judgment call. So statistics backwards, right? We'll do the math first and we'll figure out what it means later. We do a fair share of that anyway. Anytime we're doing something that's empirically good. So latent trait models look at underlying trait that is supposed to provide sample free. In other words, we're not worried about that item compared to the rest of the test. We're not worried about that item with respect to the group, as long as that, we've had assumptions for external validity with respect to how a group compares to another group to which we want to administer that test data, we would expect to see the same characteristics. So this is what I was saying before. Around since the 1940s, if you had a hand calculator, or 1947, you had access to this very rare UNIVAC, you could have been doing these, but without software, they just didn't, it just wasn't as common. Now, the thing that kind of stops us from doing this on a wide basis, a lot of times we're measuring, or we're using tests, we haven't administered that test to at least 200 people or more. Measure the underlying ability and tell you what level does somebody have to possess that ability before they can endorse that item in the key direction, what proportion of the time. We'll get to that in a minute. So sample-free and statistics are not dependent on the test, local independence. So they're not dependent on the test, or perhaps the situation in which we generate them. And again, the caveat here is making sure that you're going to apply them to another population, that other population is similar, by however you want to define similar. And what happens is we can be a little bit more specific and be a little bit more flexible. So, item response theory, or how, as many of us call it, BERT. No, I'm kidding. Family of latent trait models. Now, by calling this a family, the idea is that there isn't just one specific way of calculating item response theories, coefficients, or item characteristic curves. There's a lot of different ways. Most of them are going to be fairly similar, and then we'll talk about one parameter and Roche models, which are two different methods, but usually to calculate a one parameter model, but usually lead to the same results. Also called modern psychophysics. because we're using this all the time. If we have something where we have a test generating equivalent ones in real time, chances are what it's doing is matching item characteristic curves to come up with some kind of test. And sometimes varying those item characteristic curves to make sure that you get the right amount of easy to difficult items, or low discrimination with items that are sensitive to insensitive, to try to produce some kind of bigger picture of individuals and populations. Advantages of the CTT. With the NOPD test, what we did here was we did the classical two-score theory analyses. The Department of Justice monitors did the IRT analyses because, well, mostly because we didn't have the software and I didn't feel like dealing with it because I had much to do. Although, I could have got the software and told Reagan that I would desire to do it, so I didn't use it. Here's the software, do this, don't mess it up. Item response functions. So we can generate these curves that tell us the probability of, of what quantity of whatever it is we're trying to measure, whether it's depression, bipolar disorder, extroversion, job knowledge, whatever it is we're trying to measure, what proportion or how much of people have to have of that latent trait before they're able to endorse the item in key direction. Information quality function, the ability to differentiate among respondents. So this one is going to usually produce kind of a sigmoid curve. What this is going to produce is it's going to tell us at what ability level or what proportion relevant to that latent trait does it discriminate. In other words, if let's say it was and the way this gets calibrated is that here's your proportion. And here's the amount proportion that endorse the item in the key direction. And here's the amount of latent trait they have. So, and we'll use the letter theta. Theta could be whatever the heck we're trying to measure. So proportion that get it correct. Item response functions typically look like this. What we're interested in with the one parameter model is at what point, with respect to possessing the latent trait, the people have to have on average before they're able to answer the item. And, the key direction 50% of the time. Yeah. How much of the latent trait do people have to have before they're able to answer the item in the key direction 50% of the time? Now, if you've had a class in psychophysics, this might sound kind of good. Anybody worked with IRT before? Oh, we'll get Collins. Maybe Collins. Okay. Yeah, we have something in psychophysics called the just noticeable difference. So, in the 19th century, when they were starting to experiment with psychology, and they would vary light levels and sound levels, what they would try to do is try to figure out at what where the point was where people could distinguish between a change in the light, a change in the color, a change in the sound level half the time. That was something called the just noticeable difference, or JND. So if you access something about psychophysics, you get a pretty good explanation on that. And what's kind of cool about that is they took that same theory and sort of applied that idea of just noticeable difference, item response theory. Now, where does this originally come from? This comes from signal detection theory in physics. We do a lot of that with psychometrics. We've adapted things from other sciences. Why, if you're presenting some of the stuff, and somebody is either in physics or engineering, and they're going to look at it and say, "What are you applying that to?" Well, I understand what you're doing there, but that doesn't make sense in that context. So, or getting somebody from the math department where you're calculating averages on a Likert scale and pointing out that, well, wait a minute, that's an ordinal scale. You're treating it like it's interval. You're murdering the math. Like, yeah, but still make good decisions out of it. Okay, so the item information function. If we're going to look at the item information function, we might have something like this. Let's say this is z equals 0, and this is telling us how that item is discriminating. Well, this is 0 right here. This kind of indicates that people that are down in -1 in that area you're getting more information about those people, so it's actually discriminating more below whatever the mean is. And we can do the same thing the other direction. So this item is actually discriminating in areas that are above the mean. So item characteristic curve and item information. Now again, we could have drawn that example. We could have used something else like extroversion or introversion as being the theta. We could have used, clinical depression or bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. It's all going to work out about the same. It's all the same convention. Or, what's the idea? At the end of the day, if they're talking about psychology, different areas of psychology, people, I've heard this at APS, the American Association for Psychological Science, multi-discipline, and people also like to make the statement, well, at the end of the day, we're all psychologists. And it's like, I'm sitting like, oh, give me a break. You all hold hands and start singing Kumbaya. But, point of location, I mean, in terms of what we're using, in terms of how we do this stuff, it doesn't matter what area of psychology you're applied psychology or business or applied social science, a lot of this is just going to end up being the same. We're just going to apply it to different things or different phenomena we're interested in. Invariance, the position of a latent trait estimated by items with known item response functions and item characteristics, population dependent. In other words, kind of where this is going is with respect to invariance. Your answer on one item isn't dependent on your answer on another item. Now, we didn't have that with classical truth score theory, because to be able to interpret those discrimination indices, you had to think about all the other items that are in that set to be able to calculate either that upper quarter, lower quarter, or the point by zero correlation. With this, we're just pulling the item out of the test. And again, the way we can do that is we can, these programs calculate how much of this variance isn't unique to any item, how much of this is shared, if that represents the latent trait. And all we have to do is compare each item to that variance. That makes sense, or is that like one of those questions I don't want to ask in Denver with a crowd that's had a bunch of medicals? Last time I was in Denver, walking down that mall on 16th Street, it smelled a lot different than it had 2 years ago. Item response function, latent variable individual differences on the construct and probability of endorsing the item with that idea of, if we're going to, that idea of the just noticeable difference point, that 50% point, that's what we call the discrimination value on the item response function. So at what point is it, dividing the group kind of in half? At what point of 50 people, how much of that data do people have to have to endorse the item in the key direction 50% of the time? So item response function models, trait level and item properties, and probability of endorsing these items. Examining trait levels are, that should be capitalized, right? Greek letter theta, and typically has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. What does that sound like? Yeah. So in other words, something that is going to be basically, standard normal deviation. So, and again, in reporting z-scores, for most people that are familiar with z-scores or standard normal deviation calculations, you're not making your day by telling them the score to. Converted to an item characteristic curve, graphic functions that represent the respondent's ability as a function of probability of endorsing the item. Again, draw that out. I've also got some graphics here. But, the idea that here's data, right? Here's 0. And most of the time, if we're talking about some kind of standardized value, by the time we've gone out 3, we've got 99% of the range covered. So in this case, here's the characteristic of interest. Here's the mean. Here's below the mean, above the mean, and the probability of endorsing it correctly. And a lot of times we get a nice sigmoid function, and with how I have this here, put the, okay, so the discrimination point here is going to be 0. So when we're reporting these characteristics, what we're going to do is, if we're talking about discrimination function, we'll report it in terms of how it corresponds to value here on the axis, the horizontal axis. That makes sense? So this would be a lot like standard deviations, except in this case, you're not going to have the normal curve, because typically what's going to happen is the more of this that you have, the greater the likelihood of endorsing the item in the key direction becomes until you max out someplace. However, there are situations where you can measure some things and you're going to get a function like that, where with some characteristics, it's going to be curvilinear. This doesn't happen too often. It does not happen with knowledge-based items. So if we're doing employment testing, if we're doing something we're trying to evaluate people for fitness in some kind of occupational setting, that isn't going to happen. This could happen if we're doing something with some of the personality measures. Yeah, just as kind of the side, one of the things I found interesting with the last conference I went to, PSYC, was they were looking at conscientiousness and leadership performance. And historically, we thought, okay, the more conscientious people are, the better performance they're going to be. And so now they've got about 5 years worth of data that looks at leadership, and they found that once people have, well, here's where it gets interesting. Once people have IQ scores 2 standard deviations above the mean, it's hard to predict leadership if the prediction falls apart. In other words, it's kind of like a bell curve that falls apart. And then with conscientiousness, 2 standard deviations above the mean, leadership ability falls down. And the explanation for that was, in leadership situations, the real conscientious people, if people aren't stepping up, they'll do the work for them. If people are a little bit lower in conscientiousness, they'll just push the work back to the subordinates. I thought that's kind of interesting because, you know, again, we've been looking at things with respect to performance prediction in terms of more results better, and sometimes it's not. Trying to think, Tony Young, who occasionally teaches on campus here, has done work with the hexacode in comparing some kinds of outputs and some these kinds of relationships. We're going to do the item response, the item characteristic curve, and more of something translates into lower. But again, for most people that are working in most areas of testing, this isn't going to be the case. The graphic function represents respondent's ability as a function the probability of endorsing the item, and by endorsing the item, either the correct answer or the key. Okay. So location, this is what we're talking about. We define as the amount of the latent trait that's needed to have a 0.5 probability of endorsing the item. And again, when we're going to specify that location, we're going to look at the horizontal axis. We're going to specify that in terms of the z-coordinates that we're looking at. The higher the b parameter, okay, the higher the level the respondent needs to endorse the item. So a perfect item, or what I would consider if I was doing some kind of employment test, the perfect curve would not be a curve. It'd be something like this, where here's everybody responding, and boom, at a certain point, everybody gets the item correct. So it goes from 0, hit whatever proportion of the latent trait they need, and goes up to 100%. How's that for a conceptual ideal? Yeah, and then what Toddy and I often talk about is, can we come up with we're striving towards having a one-item test that explains everything and has that characteristic. We just have to figure out what that question is. Right? Anyway, analogous to the difficulty level in classic two-score theory, the p-value, and like z-scores, the values are going to range from -3 to 3. We could stretch them out, to 10 if we wanted to, but what's the point when you look at the proportion of the range that that's going to be? Steepness of the item response functions of the location. With this, I mean, you can't argue that that's not going to be steep. In other words, steepness, I mean, think about that in terms of what does steepness generally represent. With a lot of the item characteristic curves are going to be kind of gradient. With this example here, hypothetical and not very likely. But this would be an example. If you had a perfect item, this is what it would look like. Item discrimination, how strongly related to items the latent trait is like in loading and factor analysis. How many people have had a little bit of work with factor analysis? So, how much does that item correlate with the latent trait or the characteristic? Items with high discrimination are better at differentiating respondents around the location point. Small changes in the latent trait can lead to large changes in the probability of endorsing the item, or vice versa, with low discrimination. Well, an example of a low discrimination item. The item characteristic curve. So the steeper that curve, or if that curve becomes steep at some point, indicates it's going to be a higher discrimination. That example here, that would have perfect discrimination. That's what Toddy and I were after with the, find the perfect question to ask that predicts all performance. We'll write the question down. We'll get it copywritten, and he and I will retire rich. I looked him up this morning to see where he was because the text tracker. Yeah. So I'm sitting in a meeting this morning, at the Eros meeting, and he's sitting on the beach in Maui. So it's like, wow, rough life. I was almost half tempted to just go ahead and put him on Skype and say, hey, looks like you're not busy. You might be kind of bored, so I thought I'd get some bones here. Okay, so again, probability of endorsing item and latent trait. And again, this is the 50% point right here. And we can say that, okay, just like psychophysics, it's the just noticeable difference. And again, this is about, the whole process is about single. Now, two different items here. Same discrimination here in terms of how they're differentiated among test takers. But if you look at this item here, item 1, you actually you can endorse that. If, let's say, this was a knowledge-based item, this is the easy item. The discriminating, but more people are going to endorse this in the key direction, or you need less of the latent trait to endorse the key direction. Now, if you're doing something with, let's say, screening for psychopathology, you can also make the argument that this item here is going to be more sensitive. That is, it's going to pick up the latent trait easier than the other item, if that would make sense. Now, different discriminations and different locations. So the item that's going to be more discriminating is going to be this one right here, because look at the steepness of the curve, and have a different discrimination. In other words, somebody's going to need more of the latent trait to be able to endorse that in the key direction. This one less, but less discriminating. If you're looking across items on a test, and let's say it was a well-functioning test, you probably find a lot of patterns that look like these patterns. Now, something else we're going to add to this, the guessing parameter, which is kind of like the distractor analysis of classical truth score theory. So we can add a C parameter. Now, why don't we do this every time we do item response theory? Kind of goes back to the rationale to why we don't do item response theory every time we do item analysis. The more parameters you add to these models, the bigger the numbers need to be. And that's going to be true anytime we're looking at anything involving that common variance, whether it's factor analysis, discriminant analysis, cluster analysis, that we're going to usually have to have fairly big numbers if we're going to try to look for groups or patterns that involve shared variance. So with a 3-parameter model, you probably, what I say on the safe side, I wouldn't do this with less than 1,200 respondents. With the NOPD analyses that were done recently, it was 770 observations, which would have been the lower limit for being able to do a 2-parameter model. And the C parameter. Respondents or examinees with very low trait levels might still get that item right. So if you're talking about a knowledge-based test, if you're talking about the GRE test, this would be, what proportion of people are guessing getting it correct. How cool is that? Something where you can actually estimate the guessing parameter. Whereas if we're going to do this with classical two-score theory, sometimes we know what it is, but other times the distractors, we don't have a clear pattern with the distractors, it makes it real hard. If this was something we're doing personality or psychopathology testing, it's going to kind of indicate that some people are going to test in that direction, regardless of whether they possess the latent trait or not. Okay. So the example or the last line I have here, multiple choice testing, the values should not be excessively the reciprocal of the number of choices. So what does that mean? Have anybody talked about reciprocals since sophomore year in high school? Actually, this sixth grade, I think. Reciprocals. It was last week fall they had this. What's that? Okay. So, yeah. The reciprocal of, yeah. So in this case, what we're saying is if you have 4 options, it shouldn't exceed 25%. So, 4 over 1, 1 over 4. I hope that comes back really easily. You already do it. So some examples here. Different locations, different asymptotes. Are you all familiar with what asymptotes and asymptotic are? That idea that it's going to keep curving down, it's going to keep approaching 0, it's going to extend out to infinity, it's never going to touch 0. So, there's another, wrap your mind around it type question. I think what, is giving the Denver example before, and, if you ever lived in a residence, well, I don't know if it happens anymore, but to me it all seemed like within a dormitory, there was some kind of rule that at least 5 to 10% of the population had to be stoners. So it's like you're going to be working on some of the stuff and then talk to them about it and get that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and at this point in my life, I'm thinking, okay, why was I so damn serious? So different asymptotes, and basically what this is where this comes in. It's indicating that okay, 20% of the people who have 3 standard deviations below the mean of whatever the latent trait is are likely to endorse that item in the key direction. So this one, nobody's guessing on it. It was a knowledge-based item. This one, people are guessing about 20% of the time in getting the item in the key direction. So really handy if what you're trying to do is if you're trying to get 20 items. Now, if you had a situation where, let's say, these were the same items but 2 different populations, that's where you might be looking at this and thinking, okay, do I have problems with differential item functioning? If so, is what's happening here is the wording on this item favoring whatever this population is to the disadvantage of this population. In which case, if that was true, then you would have problems with the test. So let's add another parameter here, D parameter. Respondents very high in the latent trait are not guaranteed or have less than a probability of 1 to endorse the item. Often the item is difficult to endorse. So, for example, suicide ideation is being an indication of depression. Okay, now explain that one. I would guess not everybody in here has had a class in counseling or clinical psychology. So I was looking at this example years ago, and it kind of made sense. One of the last classes I had my senior undergraduate year was the Intro to Counseling and Counseling Methods, which for the undergraduates it was the same as the graduate class, except what happens when a class is dualistic. What is it that the graduates do that the undergraduates don't? Have to write that damn paper. Right? So the undergraduates took 3 tests and quizzes and wrote a short paper. The graduates, same content, and had to write that long paper. So anyway, the idea with suicide ideation and depression is if we're going to say, here's the probability of suicide ideation, and here's depression, and here's our standard normal deviates, and here's -3, -2, -1. Here's the mean, 1, 2, and 3. Now, if people are not depressed, what's the likelihood of committing suicide? Or let's not say committing suicide, let's say talking about suicide, thinking about suicide as being a solution to all the problems. Not really likely, is it? So something like this would happen. And then by the time people get up to an average level of depression, they're going to be thinking about suicide. But then, according to theory, what happens is it goes too far, is people become so depressed, they don't even care about committing suicide. So this is one of the things that I think Tony Young was running into with his hexacode item functions. I remember looking at that years ago and was doing the analyses, and it's like, this isn't possible. And I looked at it, I don't recall what it was he was looking at specifically, but I looked at the explanation. It's like, no, that doesn't make sense. So this would be, having some kind of a deep ramp where things could actually flip or change the function. So, what happens with that 3-parameter model? Again, we're going to introduce that guessing parameter, or people will get this correctly. 4-parameter model. If we could do that, if we don't have it flipped, that's and get the other side of the asymptote. Generally speaking, for most of the types of item analyses that people are going to do with most standard tests, a 2-parameter model can function or get you whatever to be able to provide the information that you need. Because basically what you're looking at is whether or not the item discriminates, and what's that discrimination function look like. 4-parameter model, theta represents, again, anything we're trying to measure. V is the item difficulty, or whether or not the probability that somebody goes to the different direction. A is going to be the steepness of the function, and D is the upper asymptote. In other words, the other end of the line, so to speak. 3-parameter model, logistic model, upper asymptote is going to be set to 1.0. So that's what the difference is. So in other words, what we're going to assume is that wherever that line is going to end, or where it's going to become, where it's going to approach, it's going to become asymptotic, that's going to be 1. It's going to approach that 1, it's never going to touch that 1, but we're going to stop at 1. Individuals with low trait levels have a non-zero probability of endorsing the item. 2-parameter, lower asymptote, constraint 0, then the model is going to be 2-parameter, 2PL. Item response function is very both, again, with the discrimination and the difficulty. At a minimum, let me stop it with the 1-parameter model. What was the minimum bit of information you wanted to compare it? Or you can compare the item to whatever you're trying to measure, or you can compare how that item is functioning within group 1 versus group 2. So we're going to just look at that point. Whatever you want to call it, just noticeable difference of the percent point. And again, that's probably the most important bit of information. You only get one bit of information out of this approach, is to get that. Okay, 1-parameter model, working backwards on this, the item's discrimination is going to be set to 1. And basically, we care. Well, if this is the only information we can get, this is going to work for us to be able to understand what's happening with that item, how will that item measure what it is that we want to measure. And the idea with this is it's going to be equivalent to factor loadings. And again, if you have that factor analysis, don't worry about this, because we'll pick up with factor analysis in a later class. Okay, so quick detour here. Roche model versus item response theory. Roche models, in terms of what they're going to produce, are going to be just about identical to IRT. Now, again, we say IRT, it isn't going to be one specific way of calculating. What it's going to be is it's going to be, like we say, a family of calculations. Could you get slightly different information out of different IRT packages? And the answer to that is yes. Depending on whose package it is, depending on how the formulas are set up, depending on whether it's single or double precision. Again, like I said earlier, most of the software now is running with 60 decimal places. One of the differences here is the item superior, or the Roche model, or the model itself is superior. So in other words, what that's saying is, if something doesn't fit with the model, then using a Roche model is going to trim it out, it's going to pull it out. Now, whether or not that's a good or bad thing, that's kind of a conceptual discussion. A Roche model does not permit abilities to be estimated for extreme observation, or extreme persons and items. So there's a limitation. Now, the reason this is worth mentioning is a lot of the free software is going to do a one-parameter model is going to give you Roche models. Now, if what you're looking at is calibrating items that are going to fall within, like a fairly narrow range, that could be a software that works. But if not, if you're looking at tests that are going to measure extremes, let's say, extreme attitudinal items, or you're talking about extreme populations, that's where you might want to actually take in terms of doing at least a 2 or 3 parameter model. Response curves, item functions are added to the items and be put together to create a test response curve. And this is what happens with like a GRE test where it's creating equivalent forms in real time, or where it's, for all of you that took the test in the last 5 years, has it been for all of you, or sooner? Anybody take it past 5 years? I thought maybe college would have clicked. Tonight is pickup college. Yeah, what should be happening is that it's generating equivalent forms, so generating the form as you're taking it based on the responses to try to do something where it's not generating item characteristic curves because the machines don't need the curves, but they're going to match the items to try to get the cleanest and most exact measurement of your ability with respect to quantitative or inferable or anything else these tests measure. Item information function. So item reliability is replaced by that item information function. That was where drawing kind of that bell curve, saying that, okay, at this level, here's where it kind of differentiates among people. So transformed into something where we're going to use whatever you want to call it. I don't know, what do you all call this kind of a graphic? I've heard people call this a frequency polygon. No, I don't think it's a polygon, I think it's a polygon. But anytime we're calculating frequency and we're showing it visually using some kind of indicator before, like I said, technically constitutes a some kind of polygon. Now that's going back to what? That's first grade math. Draw a polygon, draw a rectangle, draw a square. And you got points if you do the difference between a rectangle and a square. And yeah, it was like, was that easy? No, actually, no. Standard error of measurement, which is the variance within that latent trait, is the reciprocal of the information, and thus more information means less error. In other words, we're getting more precise with this measurement. Error is expressed on the same metric as the latent trait levels, so it could be used to build confidence intervals based on the item response. So we'll pick away with this, I can do a little bit of this with the later class. So information functions, difficulty, discrimination, large discriminations, tall and narrow, high precision, low discrimination, short and wide. So anytime we're looking at this represented graphically, it's going to be better that something be more like that, which is kind of an ideal but not really happening realistically. Kind of like that. If we have something like that, if I saw that kind of an item function, that'd be an item I'd get rid of, because that item is pretty, put it in everyday language. That item is pretty sloppy. Now, going back to this. What am I looking at with the 4-parameter model? How did that differ? What information did we get out of that? Yeah, so this upper asymptote isn't necessarily going to be set to 1. It's going to be, whatever it is. 3-parameter model. is that guessing, or probability of endorsing the item in the key direction, even if you possess none of the latent trait. And the two-parameter model, you just asked that before, but you all remember it, right? Location and discrimination. We'll go through some of this. So we're going to stop here. I got a couple of things I want to talk about. I'm going to stop. This is slide 28. Yeah, someday I hope to have really good technology where I can just have the remote or just have it on the camera. Oh, wait a minute, that's what I need an undergraduate working for. Remember watching classes getting video years ago where they had the big video camera, then big video cameras became small cameras, and I don't know, does anybody in here still have a video camera? Ever had one? I hung on to I've got like a Sony video camera from about 18, 19 years ago. I remember if it was a VHS-C or if it was the 8mm tapes. I don't know anything with it in terms of video camera, but it makes a good night vision device. So, so in other words, the power goes out. Where's the damn camera? Actually, it's been kind of handy, like going out and hiking at night and seeing what kind of wildlife is out and about. Go armadillo spotting with it. Okay, if I was going to do something where I'm looking at differential item functioning using item response theory, first pass through, take a look at the item characteristic curve that's generated by the whole population. If that looks good, then start splitting it into lines or analyses where I'm looking at two different groups. So, for example, if let's say I'm doing something where I'm testing math ability or quantitative ability, and I get something like this, and let's say this is the item characteristic curve. Let's say we're doing a 3-parameter curve looking at a quantitative ability item in men and women. And that's the curve for men. Tell you what, I've got one other color here. I'm going to Christmas things up a little bit, wrong time of the year. Okay, so here's the curve for women. Let's say we've got this location. Discrimination looks about the same in terms of discrimination function, but we've got two different locations. And the other thing we can do is we can quantitate, there's ways of quantifying the space between the two lines. So I've got that much space. Could come up with a statistic that expresses what that amount of space is. And there's ways of statistically testing that to see if that's a significant proportion of space. Or the other thing you can do is just test the two lines, just the item functions, the item response function. Now, with this, I'd have some kind of concern here that if this is math item, is it somehow biased because more men, or you've got a proportion of men that are guessing right or getting the item right versus none of the women are getting it. Okay, so what's going on here? Did I set this up in some way where it was either easy to guess or something in the STEM kind of set things up with, in terms of what men are familiar with, where men are able to answer the question, even if your answer on that doesn't really load or doesn't really relate the commonality variance that's shared with the other items. So I might have a problem here. Now, how do I determine whether or not I have a problem? Or how do I determine? Here's the thing with the guessing parameter. That kind of creeps into the picture. You have one group guessing, the other group isn't guessing. The one group is automatically getting it right. Then it kind of does flag things as possible to be biased. If you had two different, let's say, I was doing this with a 2-parameter model, and I have two different item response curves, I might have to back up and say, okay, let's examine this item. Let's talk to experts on this content domain or measuring this area, and see if we have some potential bias or something else where things are going to we have to make things, we make some kind of decision perhaps in a direction. When the guessing parameter kicks in, then it's you know, maybe a stronger indicator of what's happening here, and if this is truly going to be a large number. Not good, but stronger indicator. Going back to classical truth score theory. If I want to see if the test is measuring some kind of homogeneous whole, if it's measuring roughly the same thing, that's where coefficient alpha comes in. So Cronbach's coefficient alpha is the most commonly used one. It's the one that's in SPSS. If you looked at JASP, and we'll fire up JASP one of these days and start doing some item analysis with that. Coefficient alpha is also the formula that's used in there. And basically what this does, it gives you the algebraic analog of comparing all possible, the mean of all possible pairwise comparisons among the items. Okay. So if all those items kind of, it would compare by, you know, every way we can divide the item set, and it holds together. Pretty good indicator that, okay, this test is measuring a homogeneous subset or measuring the same thing. The other thing about coefficient alpha, I think I mentioned this last week, but if I didn't, I'm going to do it now. It tends to be a lower bound estimate. That is, it tends to be a more conservative estimate of paternal consistency. So if I had to default to one of these, I would use coefficient alpha. Now, if we're going to use coefficient alpha to look for differences between groups, we can calculate coefficient alpha, you know, for men or women, or for whatever the two groups are, and see if it's roughly the same. If they're not the same, yeah, then we might have to take a look at the test. Usually, if I'm going to do something where I'm going to analyze a test and think about modifying a test, I'm going to look at the item level. Something else we'll talk about in here with respect to looking at differences between correlation coefficients. You want to take a look at this and Google it, Fisher's R to Z transformation. And basically that'll let you take any two correlation coefficients and determine whether or not they're either significantly different on the basis of, you know, statistically significantly different or not. And the other thing I said I do when I'm doing these types of calculations is I'm going to err on the side of plate the type 1 error, because if there's anything wrong with the test or anything problematic, better to err on the side of caution and analyze and deal with it. Biserial correlation, what was that again? Well, seriously, I'm going to look for that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to dichotomize one variable and the other is going to be continuous. And the idea was we could correlate endorsing an item in the key direction or providing the correct response to an item. How well does that correlate with total score? And if that's positive, it indicates that, yeah, that item is measuring and contributing. If it's negative, it means that item either doesn't belong with that test or you miskeyed something. Difficulty level. Again, you know, what's the proportion of people that got something correct? Again, we can take a look at that between two groups and say, okay, well, with the math item, 90% of the guys got it correct, and 20% of the women got it correct. So let's take a look at this item and make sure that it's differences between the groups and not necessarily it's not the item. Now, again, I don't usually use that one because it's usually a little bit better to use the biserial correlation. And when I have the sample size of the means, I would certainly use item response theory. Look at least two parameter item characteristics to try to determine whether or not something works or it's not functioning. Okay, so let's stop with 8. It's 8. Any questions on that? Hopefully, that seems a little bit clearer than the Washita or the Mississippi right now, or the pond out at Lincoln Parish Park. I'm, often not sure if I should swim in that thing. About the time I go, the times I've gone swimming, come home later in the day, turn on the news, and it's like brain-eating amoebas have been found in area ponds and lakes. It's like, I don't know. What I'm going to do with the presentation is this should be posted probably by about 9:30. It usually takes YouTube about half an hour to 45 minutes to process the video. I'll post the link and then I'll put up a discussion post if anybody has any questions. There was questions about the exam in here. And a number of people are going to be taking off the APA. Actually, I'll be taking off for a conference probably the week before. So how we're going to cover class then, and then the 8th was the final exam. So one or two possibilities, either people will take it early or it will be posted as an offline. But anyway, even if it's during a test time, we'll work around that so that everybody can get done the things they need to get done this summer. Questions, comments, concerns, you all still sort of awake? Yeah, nothing more exciting than psychometrics. And on that note, I'll stop the recording.